Hello, and welcome to our symposium about the experiences of autistic college students. Throughout the course of our 3 talks today, we will be looking at a variety of areas of the college experience. We'll be starting with predictors of first-year success and adjustment to life on campus. And then we'll be talking about sexual victimization and unwanted sexual contact amongst students who identify as having autism. And then we'll talk about the discrimination and harassment experiences of this group of college students. My name is Maria Pizzano, and I'm a co-chair today along with Lauren Baczewski, who will be presenting one of our talks. This topic is particularly important because autistic students attend post-secondary education at a rate that is half that of their neurotypical peers. Furthermore, those who do attend college are less likely to continue their educational career and complete those degrees that they begin. Since a college degree is nowadays, in particular, essential for developing independence as an adult, this has a large impact on the ability of autistic individuals to maintain employment and independence into adulthood. Throughout the course of our talks today, we'll be describing some self-reported experiences from this group of college students. Hopefully, through the talks, we'll be shedding some light on areas of potential support and ways to encourage their retention and degree completion at the college level. Our first talk today will be discussing the role of first-year adjustment in predicting freshman year success and well-being for autistic students. This talk looks at survey information collected both at the beginning of these students' first year as well as at the end of their first year to see what factors are related to successful adjustment experiences. The second talk today will be discussing sexual victimization and feelings of unsafety amongst autistic undergraduate students. This talk will be presented by Natalie Libster. Our third talk today will be illuminating discrimination, bias, and social disconnection amongst students who identify as having autism while they're in college. This talk will be presented by Sohyun Kim. Last, Alexandra Sturm will serve as our discussant and tie these 3 talks together. Overall, they will reveal the unique experiences of autistic students in college and point to particular indicators of success and ways that we can continue to support this group to ensure that they complete the degrees that they begin. I hope you enjoy, and thank you again for attending our talk today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lauren Baczewski, and today I'm going to be talking to you about predictors of first-year adjustment for autistic college students. What factors are most important? So why is the first year of college so important? We know that there's a growing number of autistic students in higher education, but relatively little is known about the persistence of autistic students in the higher education environment or factors that affect their success or retention in college. We also know that students' decisions to remain enrolled are significantly impacted by their adjustment to the college context during their first year. So what is college adjustment? Adjustment refers to a student's ability to adapt to the unique demands and nuances of the college context. It spans multiple domains, as you can see here, including academic adjustment, institutional attachment or satisfaction with the institution, social adjustment, and personal emotional adjustment, which represents psychological well-being in the college context. And for neurotypical college students, the literature shows that positive self-concept, social support, and resilience in the face of competing demands are all related to more positive college adjustment outcomes. For autistic students, the picture is much less clear. Very few studies have examined college adjustment among this population, and those that do report that autistic students have poorer academic adjustment outcomes than students with other diagnoses or neurotypical peers. However, these studies do not control for key sociodemographic characteristics like mental health status or race and ethnicity. And this study aimed to address that gap. So using a sample of self-identified autistic college students and ADHD and neurotypical peers who were matched on sociodemographic characteristics, we investigated predictors of first-year adjustment outcomes and whether a diagnostic group moderates those effects. In pursuit of this aim, we conducted a secondary data analysis of national survey data. Data was collected across 2 survey measures. The first was the freshman year survey, which happens at the start of the first year of college. And the second is the Your First College Year survey, which is administered at the end of the first year. And these surveys are managed by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA and are distributed by individual post-secondary institutions across the country. And that includes both 2- and 4-year schools, as well as public and private schools. Our sample includes 3 groups of students who are matched on sociodemographic factors, including race, ethnicity, gender, frequency of depression at college start, survey year, and college selectivity, which is a proxy for SAT score. And you can see our 3 groups here: our autistic group, our ADHD group, and neurotypical group. And participants were included in the study if they had data across both surveys, one at the start of the year and one at the end of the year, across the survey years you can see here. So we had a final sample of 222 students, 74 who self-identified as autistic. So the majority of our sample was white and male, which is reflective of the larger sample that our sample was pulled from. And this demographic breakdown, particularly our racial and ethnic diversity in the sample, is not representative of the racial ethnic diversity of the broader autistic population in the United States. So survey studies should work to address this if they're pulling from national data. Our diagnostic groups were not significantly different on any demographic variables that you see here. So how did we investigate predictors of positive adjustment outcomes in our sample? First, we created constructs that represent each domain of adjustment, as you see here. For example, our academic adjustment outcome was intellectual self-confidence at the end of the year. And each construct is made up of a series of survey items from the end of year survey. And all of these constructs had a Cronbach's alpha of 0.6 or above. So we conducted separate general linear models for each outcome of interest that you can see here. Predictors included social factors, including social self-confidence and ease of making new friends, as well as the ability to balance academic and social demands, and the interaction between each predictor and diagnostic group. Our predictors were derived from findings of qualitative studies that tell us the factors that autistic students report as being most important to their college experiences. Covariates in our models included survey year, college selectivity, frequency of depression at entry, and we applied a Bonferroni correction for multiple comparisons based on the number of outcomes. And so our adjusted P level was 0.008. So our results showed that social factors, including social self-confidence and ease of making friends, uniquely predict social adjustment at the end of the year. Additionally, ability to balance academic and social demands uniquely predicted academic adjustment at the end of the first year. And both ability to balance demands and social factors predicted personal emotional adjustment and institutional adjustment outcomes. Importantly, there were no significant interactions between any predictor and diagnostic group. And that really suggests that these predictors are equally important for our autistic, ADHD, and neurotypical students in this sample. All right, so what are our key takeaways? For neurotypical and neurodiverse students alike, social factors, including ease of making friends and social self-confidence at the start of the year, are critically important to social, emotional, and institutional adjustment outcomes. Additionally, ability to balance competing demands during the first year is predictive of lower psychological stress, increased institutional attachment, and increased academic performance. And overall, our findings show that when we account for demographic and mental health characteristics entering college, we find that the same predictors of first-year adjustment are important for all students in our sample. So future studies should explore and need to account for the impact of these co-occurring mental health diagnoses or challenges on autistic college students' experiences, as well as their adjustment to the college environment as a whole. Some implications for college campuses from our results suggest that institutions should develop first-year programming that targets these core areas, including social self-confidence, social support, and making social connections upon arriving at college, as well as time management and organizational tools for balancing demands. Thanks very much, and I look forward to speaking with you more.
Hi, my name is Natalie Libster, and today I'll be discussing sexual victimization and feelings of unsafety in undergraduate students with autism spectrum disorder. Before I begin, I just want to mention that this presentation includes content related to sexual violence that may be upsetting or triggering to survivors. I'd first like to provide some definitions of terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation. Sexual victimization consists of unwanted sexual contact and sexual assault. In the current study, unwanted sexual contact was defined as nonverbal, verbal, and brief physical behavior of a sexual nature. For example, unwanted sexual photos or comments. Sexual assault was defined as attempted or committed physical acts of a sexual nature in which the victim did not give consent. For example, sexual coercion or rape. A seminal study by Brown, Loyola et al. Found that compared to neurotypical adults, autistic adults experienced higher rates of sexual contact, sexual coercion, rape, and attempted rape. This increased risk was partially mediated by level of sexual knowledge. The researchers found that autistic adults were less likely than those without a disability to receive sexual education from peers, parents, and teachers. And they proposed 3 explanations for this finding. First, the social challenges associated with autism often result in social isolation and peer rejection. And this may prevent autistic youth from learning about sexual norms from their peers. Second, many parents of autistic youth are hesitant to discuss sex-related topics with their children because they believe that these discussions will increase their children's sexual interest. Finally, sex education may not be available to autistic youth in schools or adapted to meet their unique social challenges. So all of these risk factors may increase the likelihood of sexual victimization among autistic youth. A recent study by Brown et al. Looked at rates of sexual victimization among autistic undergraduate students. And they found that 8.2% of autistic students, 9.3% of students with a non-ASD disability, and 4.6% of students without a disability experience sexual victimization. And although these statistics are alarming, they don't tell the whole story. First, there were large discrepancies in sample size among the 3 groups. there were only 158 autistic students compared to over 7,000 students with a non-ASD disability and over 27,000 students without a disability. So these differences in sample size may have influenced the results of the study. Second, the participants in the three groups were not matched on key characteristics. Differences between the three groups, for example, in gender and co-occurring diagnosis, may have influenced the results of the study. So the story that Brown et al. Are trying to tell may be more nuanced than initially presented. No studies to date have examined feelings of unsafety among autistic undergraduate students. Studies show that students who feel unsafe on campus are typically female, belong to a racial and ethnic minority group, and have previously experienced rape, attempted rape, or other sexual offenses. However, autistic adults experience higher rates of peer victimization than neurotypical adults. So this can contribute to feeling unsafe on campus. The current study addresses the following question. Among autistic undergraduate students and those without ASD, which student characteristics predict unwanted sexual contact, sexual assault, and feelings of unsafety on campus? The study analyzed secondary data collected by the Diverse Learning Environment Survey, which is developed and administered by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA. The DLE survey is administered annually to undergraduate students at 2- and 4-year institutions and is used to evaluate the campus climate. The current sample was drawn from over 53,000 surveys between 2017 and 2020. So there was a total of 270 autistic students and 270 students without ASD. When drawing the current sample, I used a very specific matching procedure. The majority of autistic adults have a co-occurring diagnosis. So I created separate data sets of individuals with a learning disability, ADHD, a psychological disorder such as anxiety and depression, as well as combinations of these three conditions. And these were all self-reported. I then drew my ASD and non-ASD samples from these data sets. And I did a case control matching procedure based on gender, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, family income, and college and university. For statistical purposes, I was only able to match on binary dimensions of gender, which are men and women. There just weren't enough gender diverse students in the sample for me to have enough statistical power. I conducted 2 logistic regression analyses to examine predictors of unwanted sexual contact and sexual assault. My predictors included ASD, LD, ADHD, psychological disorder, gender, sexual orientation, and harassment frequency. I found that gender, sexual orientation, and harassment frequency were significant predictors of sexual contact. The odds of experiencing sexual contact increased by 4.75 for women compared to men. The odds increased by 2.17 for non-heterosexual students. And for a 1-unit increase in harassment score, the odds increased by 1.05. I then found that gender, psychological disorder, and harassment frequency were significant predictors of sexual assault. The odds of experiencing sexual assault increased by 6.29 for women compared to men. The odds increased by 3.14 for students with a psychological disorder. And for a 1-unit increase in harassment score, the odds increased by 1.05. I then conducted another logistic regression to examine predictors of feeling unsafe on campus. My predictors included those from the last 2 models, as well as race and ethnicity, sense of belonging, sexual contact, and sexual assault. I found that sense of belonging, sexual contact, and harassment frequency were significant predictors of feeling unsafe on campus. For a 1-unit decrease in belonging score, the odds of feeling unsafe increased by 0.96. The odds increased by 3.49 for students who experience unwanted sexual contact. And for a 1-unit increase in harassment score, the odds increased by 1.03. So the current study found that when matched on co-occurring diagnosis and student characteristics, autistic students did not experience higher rates of sexual victimization or feelings of unsafety compared to students without ASD. Another finding was that non-heterosexual students and those with psychological disorders experienced higher rates of sexual victimization. It's important to note that 156 of 200 non-heterosexual students in the current study had a psychological disorder. So there was overlap between these two predictors, and these students may be especially at risk. It's also important to note that autistic students may be less likely to report instances of sexual victimization. Autistic individuals tend to be socially vulnerable. And for example, they have difficulty interpreting social cues. So they may struggle to understand the harmful intentions of others. They're also taught to comply with requests from others, and so they might not know how to recognize inappropriate sexual requests. In addition, autistic individuals, even those who are verbal, often experience communication difficulties. And studies have shown that autistic children have difficulty with referential communication. So what this means is that they struggle to provide enough information to a listener so that the listener understands what they're talking about. So autistic adults may struggle with the communication skills necessary to report sexual victimization. Research is needed on sexual victimization among gender diverse students. The current study did not include gender diverse students, and 3 to 6% of gender diverse individuals have ASD, which is higher than the ASD prevalence in the general population. Additional research is also needed on vulnerability among non-heterosexual students and those with a psychological disorder. And finally, the current study highlights the importance of support services for autistic students at colleges and universities, especially LGBTQ+ students and those who have co-occurring conditions. 15 to 30% of autistic people without an intellectual disability are non-heterosexual, and over 70% have a co-occurring psychological condition. So these factors may put autistic students at higher risk for sexual victimization. So disability resource officers really need to be able to provide these students with appropriate information, resources, and support. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sohyun Kim, and my research study is titled Post-Secondary Education for Students on the Autism Spectrum, Discrimination, Bias, and Social Engagement. To start with some background, outcomes for individuals with autism spectrum disorder have been steadily improving over the past few decades, and an increasing number of young adults on the spectrum are pursuing post-secondary education. In spite of such improvements, post-secondary students on the autism spectrum are more likely to face loneliness, anxiety, depression, and deliberate social exclusion during their college years when compared to their neurotypical peers. And autistic students consider withdrawing from their college significantly more than their neurotypical peers, and they're less likely to complete their post-secondary education. So through this study, we investigated the following. First, we compared the perceived experiences of discrimination, bias, and harassment among college students on the autism spectrum and their neurotypical peers. We also examined the relationship between discrimination, bias, and harassment and possible predictors contributing to these perceived negative experiences by students on the autism spectrum. We used a diverse learning environment DLE dataset from years 2017 to 2020, which was developed by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA and was administered nationwide by the Cooperative Institutional Research Program among college students attending 2-year and 4-year colleges. Our sample consisted of 358 students on the autism spectrum as self-reported, and another 358 students with no reported disabilities. These two groups were matched on their race, gender, income, institution type, whether they attend two-year college, four-year college, or university, and their first generation college student status. To begin, we created a latent variable for our two dependent variables. First, the discrimination and bias variable was a latent variable that represents a more subtle form of discrimination, such as verbal or written comments, offensive images, or social exclusion. Harassment variable was also a latent variable that represents more severe experiences such as threats, physical assault, sexual harassment, damage to personal property, or anonymous phone calls. To make the group comparisons between the ASD group and the neurotypical group, we conducted independent sample t-test and confirmed the statistical significance by bootstrapping. Here are the results from the group comparisons. As you can see, autistic students are more likely to report experiencing discrimination, bias, and harassment when compared to their neurotypical peers. And the differences were statistically significant. In order to see the bigger picture of what may contribute to such differences, we conducted a path analysis with some possible predictors. We created additional latent variables as follows. School involvement is a latent variable that measures reported involvement in various school facilitated social activities, such as fraternity or sorority, sports teams, leadership training, or culturally based social groups, or political clubs. Faculty support is a measure of perceived support that students receive from faculty to be successful in college, such as empowering the students, encouragement to ask questions, and faculty believing in their success, taking interest in students' development. And habit of mind is a reported measure of the behaviors or traits associated with academic success. And these behaviors are seen as the foundation for lifelong learning. It includes qualities such as being able to support their opinions with logical argument, problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, risk-taking, self-directed learning, and accepting mistakes as part of the learning process. Here is the path diagram with, of our analysis. So here are two dependent variables, are discrimination, bias, and harassment. And school involvement was found to have strongest relationship with both discrimination and bias, and harassment with standardized parameter estimated of 0.69 and 0.83 for harassment. And faculty support was also found to have significant relationship with discrimination and bias, with the parameter estimate of negative 0.13. And habit of mind was found to have significant relationship with harassment, with a parameter estimate of negative 0.17. Also, discrimination, bias, and harassment, those two variables were found to have high correlation with parameter estimate of 0.76. And lastly, faculty support and habit of mind were also found to have found to be correlated with parameter estimate of 0.36. And all these relationships were found to be statistically significant. As you saw previously, the extent to which students were involved in campus facilitated social events was the strongest predictor for both discrimination and harassment. And this tells us that more they seek opportunities for social connections at school, more likely to perceive discrimination, bias, and harassment, or more likely to report these negative experiences. So if seeking social opportunities results in perceiving such aversive experiences, students on the autism spectrum may avoid being involved in school events and isolate themselves further. We also found that more faculty support these students receive during the college years, less likely to report discrimination towards them. Another finding was that having habits of mind was negatively related to perceived harassment. Some protective factors that we identified based on these findings were that post-secondary schools can provide support for self-advocacy and for engagement in critical conversation with others. And faculty support and validation and encouragement of involvement through high-impact practices during their college years may be particularly protective for autistic students. Lastly, providing support for problem-solving skills and positive outlook towards learning may also serve as protective factor for this population to help them feel more connected to campus. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending our series of talks about autism in college, where we explored first-year success, sexual victimization, and also the discrimination experiences of autistic college students. My name is Alex Sturm. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And today I'm going to be discussing some of the themes that came up across the different talks, across the 3 talks. So the way that we'll structure this conversation is in talking about the past, present, and future understanding of autistic post-secondary experiences. So where are we coming from? Where are we now? What did the present studies reveal? And where are we going next? So if we think about where we're coming from, the story about the post-secondary achievement of autistic youth until very recently indicated that autistic young adults were less academically successful than their peers. This story was relatively bleak. Research had often concluded that autistic students were different from their neurotypical peers because of their autism symptoms. But now we're learning that this is not really the full picture. So much of our attention thus far has been dedicated to investigating how autism symptoms specifically contribute to educational outcomes, with little attention to the impact of co-occurring conditions such as depression, anxiety, executive function, physical health, among others. Fortunately for us, the growing voices of autistic self-advocates enrolled in post-secondary education have really shifted this direction and this focus. So students have told us as researchers that balancing the simultaneous demands of college impacted their achievement. So in that psychological services within higher education would be most beneficial for their retention. So, autistic self-advocates who are in college have really shaped this narrative through these qualitative stories that began to reveal the specific impact of co-occurring conditions on retention and provided a direction for researchers who are engaging post-secondary education data or engaging with post-secondary education data. So now let's shift. So where are we now? This is where we've been from thinking about autism as deficit, specifically because of autism symptoms, to now understanding kind of these contextual factors. So as we look toward how to support autistic students, there is growing evidence that we must focus on the impact of co-occurring mental and physical health characteristics and how these traits specifically and uniquely impact post-secondary retention. So importantly, retention in post-secondary education extends beyond academic achievement to factors that include mental health, adjustment, institutional attachment, safety on campus, among others. Exploration of these factors, because they're so critical to retention, are critical, right? Are really, really important. So the work presented today begins to address some of these previously unexplored factors that impact retention of autistic students. So the synthesized goal of the investigations that you just heard was to identify sources of risk and to really focus on how we as researchers and educators can understand this risk and how then we can use our understanding to promote resilience of students. So what did we study? What did the present studies reveal? So I'm going to highlight 3 or 4 really important themes. So 1, the impact of co-occurring traits. 2, the idea of intersectional identities and how that's important. Directions for the future, and also the need for person-environment fit. So if we think about the impact of co-occurring traits, so the studies that involved between group comparisons here that were presented today were matched both on demographic factors and also on factors related to mental health. So that's relatively unique. It's relatively unusual still to match on mental health. But the lack of diagnostic group differences that were observed in these studies when these factors were controlled indicate how important it is to accurately understand needs. What is interesting is that when you do this, so when you control clearly for these mental health and co-occurring characteristics, findings diverge from prior work that illustrate or suggest that autism is really driving this effect of academic achievement, when in reality that's not necessarily true. That's what we're finding, and retention specifically. So theme 2, we also need to consider intersectional identities and unique sources of vulnerability. So we learned that women, LGBTQ+ students, and students with psychological disorders were more vulnerable to violation of interpersonal boundaries, including sexual contact and sexual assault. So our next step needs to be to better understand how autistic students who hold multiple identities, meaning an identity of autism and potentially LGBTQ+, for example, and then other unique sources of vulnerability, such as gender, how these students might be particularly at risk. So we also need to be able to identify the specific supports that might be really crucial for these students to be successful and to be retained in post-secondary ed. So theme 3, directions for the future. It'll be interesting for us to explore self-efficacy and self-determination. So why? Because social self-confidence here was strongly predictive of all first-year adjustment outcomes in the present study. So in one of our present studies, so including social self-confidence, campus satisfaction, sense of belonging, and psychological well-being. So social self-confidence was hugely important to adjustment. So this finding points to the potential importance of exploring self-efficacy and self-determination more broadly, in addition to programs that can really support, social self-efficacy and social self-determination. So those for, social self-confidence specifically. So our traditional thinking is that self-efficacy and self-determination around social skills will increase through social skills interventions. But the voices of self-advocates have told us that this is not necessarily true, that they don't always perceive benefit from the social skills interventions. So what does that mean? That means that we need to think more creatively and engage with the autistic community to understand how can we build social self-efficacy and social self-determination to improve potentially adjustment in college. So another way to think about this is through, this theme 4, the need for person-environment fit. So we traditionally have approached person-environment fit for our neurodiverse students as how can we ensure that our neurodiverse students are going to fit into a neurotypical world? And that really doesn't set them up for success, right? Because a neurotypical world isn't really necessarily the world that's going to be the best for our neurodiverse students. This thinking can lead us to potentially negative consequences. So for example, in the current study, it was found that being engaged academically in the post-secondary community yielded no increased risk of discrimination, bias, or harassment for autistic students. So those habits of mind and also engagement with faculty. But engagement in campus activities that were purely social did elevate risk, right? So we instead need to think about how we can create inclusive and safe campus cultures and also create safe and structured opportunities for engagement that are consistent with autistic student strengths. These strengths will be varied. These strengths will be totally person dependent, but it's important to be able to create the best person environment fit possible and really make this a personalized experience to improve retention. So what are our next steps? So we need to think about the more complex interactive mechanisms that may impact autistic experiences of post-secondary education. So this includes things like identity, personal traits and characteristics, self-beliefs, intersectional identities, mental and physical health. The work presented today is just really a snapshot of this. This is just the beginning, but we've started to uncover some really important things, really important understandings about the autistic experience. So in the future, we need larger studies, particularly large longitudinal studies, to understand interactive mechanisms that impact not only retention in post-secondary education, but also well-being. We don't currently have a great study of retention. We don't know who is retained, who graduates within 4 years, 5 years, 6 years from college. All the samples that we have access to so far are flawed in some way. So this will take a larger effort from the larger community to understand the phenomenon and understand the needs. So thank you all, and we really look forward to further discussion of these topics through the question and answer session.